You're in the gym, you're being consistent, and you are definitely getting stronger. Week in, week out, you're adding weight to the bar. But when you look in the mirror, the size you're fighting for, it just isn't showing up. You're stronger, for sure, but you're not really bigger. Now, if that sounds familiar, you've slammed right into the exact wall that separates the casual lifters from the people who truly get the science of building muscle. Today, we are going to break down that wall. We're going to find out why just getting stronger isn't the whole story when it comes to getting better. So here's our game plan for this breakdown. We're going to start with that problem every single lifter faces, the dreaded plateau. Then we'll look at the textbook solution before we completely tear apart a huge myth about strength and size. From there, we'll dive deep into how your muscles actually grow, give you a practical formula you can use, and finally, help you figure out what your next level of training really looks like. All right, let's kick things off with a feeling we all know way too well. That incredibly frustrating moment when all the progress, all that momentum you've been riding, just grinds to a halt. It's the gains stall, and believe me, it is a universal part of the journey. So you're left asking yourself this one critical question. You're doing everything right, you're showing up, you're putting in the work. So why on earth have the results just vanished? Well, the answer lies in your body's amazing and sometimes annoying ability to adapt. And that right there, that's what we call the plateau effect. See, your body is an absolute master of efficiency. When you give it the same stress, the same routine over and over and over again, it just adapts. It gets so good at handling that specific challenge that it doesn't need to grow anymore. That initial reason to change is gone, and so are your gains. Now, this isn't a sign of failure. It's actually a sign that your body has conquered the challenge you gave it, and it's just waiting for a new one. Okay, so how do you give it that new challenge? Well, the first answer everyone learns, the foundational rule of getting bigger and stronger, is the overload principle. Progressive overload is, in theory, pretty simple. To keep growing, you have to continually ask your body to do more than it's used to doing. This principle is the absolute 100% non-negotiable core of any effective training program. Without that constantly increasing demand, there's no reason to adapt. And without adaptation, there is no growth. Period. But here's the thing. Progressive overload is a whole toolkit, and it's not just about adding more weight to the bar. That's the most obvious method, of course, but you can also increase the number of reps you do with the same weight. Or you could add more sets up in your total volume. You could even up the frequency, maybe training a muscle group more often. A less obvious but super effective method is to cut your rest times down between sets, making the work way more dense. Each one of these is a totally valid way to crank up the stimulus and force a new adaptation. But here's where it all gets really interesting. If progressive overload is the key, and the easiest way to measure it is by just adding weight, then getting stronger should always mean getting bigger, right? Well, this is where we have to challenge a core assumption that holds so many people back from real progress. Just think about this for a second. The athletes who can lift the most weight on the planet, we're talking elite powerlifters. They are incredibly strong, incredibly muscular, but they don't usually have that same kind of massive, almost cartoonishly full physique as an elite bodybuilder, who, by the way, probably can't match their 1-rep max. If strength was a perfect one-to-one measure for size, these athletes should look identical. The fact that they don't, well, that tells us there's something much deeper going on here. This quote from the fitness community just hits the nail on the head. We've confused the tool with the result. See, progressive overload is how we create the stimulus for growth. It is not by itself a measurement of that growth. Just because your squat went up by 10 pounds doesn't automatically mean your quads got proportionally bigger. Strength is a sign of adaptation for sure, but it's not the only one. And when it comes to building pure size, it's not always the most important one. And this misunderstanding has led to this huge debate in the fitness world. On one side, you've got the high-intensity camp. These guys believe the real key is pushing a few sets to absolute failure. They think extra volume is just a fast track to fatigue. Then, on the other side, you have the high-volume camp. They argue that the total amount of work you do, that's sets times reps times weight, is what really matters. And they point to tons of research that shows, up to a point, more recoverable volume almost always leads to more muscle growth. So, who's right? To answer that question, we have to go deeper. We need to look at the biology of the muscle cell itself. Because, as it turns out, there isn't just one way for a muscle to get bigger. Nope, there are two very distinct paths to hypertrophy.
Path number one is myofibrillar hypertrophy. Okay, so this is the growth of the actual contractile machinery in your muscles, these little proteins called actin and myosin. I want you to think of these as the tiny engines inside your muscle fibers that literally pull on each other to create force. So myofibrillar hypertrophy means you're adding more engines, making the muscle denser and way, way more capable of producing force. This is the type of growth that's directly tied to raw strength. And right alongside it, you have path number two, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. This is all about the expansion of everything else inside the muscle cell that isn't an engine. We're talking about the sarcoplasm, that's the fluid in the cell, as well as glycogen, which is your stored fuel, and other little bits and pieces. So if myofibrillar growth is adding more engines, sarcoplasmic growth is like expanding the size of the factory building and the fuel tanks around those engines. It doesn't do as much for your 1 rep max, but it massively increases the overall size and volume of the muscle.
And this two-pathway system, it perfectly explains our whole powerlifter versus bodybuilder paradox. Powerlifting, with its focus on super heavy, low-rep training, primarily stimulates that myofibrillar hypertrophy. You get denser, stronger muscle. Bodybuilding, on the other hand, with its higher volume and that focus on getting a pump, is exceptionally good at stimulating sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. You get bigger, fuller muscles.
And you know what's really cool? When scientists actually look at the muscle fibers of these athletes under a microscope, the data totally confirms this. Bodybuilders often have larger muscle fibers overall, but when you measure the force produced relative to the size of that muscle, the powerlifters win hands down. Their muscles are just more functionally dense, while bodybuilders have more total volume. And a lot of that is coming from that sarcoplasmic expansion. Okay, that's the science. We have two types of growth. So how do we actually use this knowledge to smash through our plateaus and build the physique we really want? This is where we go from theory to action with your complete hypertrophy toolkit.
Look, a truly complete strategy is so much more than just adding weight. It's about combining different kinds of stimulus. You absolutely need that heavy, intense work to drive the myofibrillar, strength-based growth. But you also need to optimize for total volume, often with different exercises and rep schemes, to max out that sarcoplasmic, size-based growth. The smartest way to do this is with periodization. You plan cycles where you focus on a strength block to build those contractile proteins, and then you switch to a volume block to expand the cell itself. And of course, none of this matters if you don't fuel the machine with proper nutrition and prioritize recovery, because growth happens when you rest, not when you're training.
So, at the end of the day, the real secret for an advanced lifter isn't to pick a side in the powerlifter versus bodybuilder debate. It's to become a hybrid. The goal is to intelligently design your training to give your body the signals for both myofibrillar and sarcoplasmic growth. You want muscle that is not only denser and stronger, but also has that full three-dimensional look. All right, let's bring it all home and see what this means for your future in the gym. It's time to graduate from the simple basics and start training with a much more sophisticated understanding of what's going on.
And if you remember one thing from this whole explainer, make it this. Moving from an intermediate to an advanced lifter means your focus has to shift. It's no longer just about adding another 5 pounds to your bench press. It's about understanding all the tools in your toolkit: intensity, volume, frequency, exercise selection, rest periods, and knowing exactly how and when to use each one to create the precise stimulus your body needs to keep adapting and keep growing.
And that leaves us with one last really fascinating question. Now that we understand the how behind these two types of growth, how can we start personalizing our training even more to hit our specific goals? What are the individual factors that might make someone respond better to volume or better to intensity? That is the next level of the science of size. And remember, science is always evolving. To make sure you don't miss out on the next scientific analysis and protocol, you've got to turn on those notifications and subscribe.
We'll see you in the next video. And hey, let's meet up in the comments. Let us know what topic we should cover next.